Population ecology examines the dynamics of different species and how these species interact with each other, interact with other species, and interact with the environment. We'll examine the dynamics of populations in terms of size, reproduction, reproductive success, their makeup, and distribution. In this lecture, we'll actually look at how gray wolves, shown here, interact with biotic and abiotic forces in Yellowstone National Park. We'll learn about their reproductive strategies, carrying capacity, roles that predators and prey play in maintaining a healthy ecosystem. Yellowstone National Park was established in 1872 as America's first national park. It's home to grizzly bears, wolves, bison, elk, bighorn sheep, and it's one of the last nearly intact natural ecosystems in North America. Yellowstone's open year-round, but perhaps it's best to visit the park from April to October because this is when you can see the diversity of wildlife that the park has to offer. You can do backcountry hiking, camping, fly fishing, canoeing, bicycling, and they have many authentic lodges and cabins where you can stay overnight. The images here show some of the sites that you'll see in Yellowstone National Park. Top left shows the Grand Prismatic Spring, which is located in this park. It's about 70 degrees Celsius or about 150 degrees Fahrenheit. And the colors are from the assortment of microorganisms that live in that hot spring. You can also see gray wolves, which are shown here, the Grand Teton Mountains, which are to the south of the park, and of course, the cute, cuddly grizzly bears as well. Yellowstone Park is located in the northwest United States. Most of the park is actually in Wyoming, but some of it also lies in Idaho and Montana as well. The park receives a little over 3 million visitors a year, but its early inhabitants were the Clovis cultures, which inhabited the park about 12,000 years ago. When the earliest Europeans visited the area in the early 1800s, the Nez Perce, Shoshone, and Crow tribes were living in and among this area. Yellowstone Lake is located in the interior of the park, and it's actually one of the largest high-altitude lakes in the world. It's at an altitude of about 2.5 kilometers or 1.5 miles above sea level, and the deepest spot of this freshwater lake is about 400 feet or 125 meters. The park itself, about 80% of the park is forests, and about 20% of the park is grassland biomes. The park actually is a big volcanic caldera, and it's been active over the last 20 million years. Some of these eruptions are very violent. Some have been estimated to be 1,000 to 2,000 times more powerful than the 1980s Mount St. Helens eruption. In this chapter, we're actually going to look at the significance of an ecosystem and maintaining healthy populations of different species. We're going to look at predator-prey interactions and look at ways of applying population dynamics to conserve or rebuild an ecosystem to the way it was before human occupation. We're going to learn about population ecology from studying the gray wolves that live in Yellowstone National Park. These animals can be very social. They live together in families, and some of them can be quite large. They range in size from about 75 to 100 pounds or 35 to 45 kilograms. Although the gray wolf was native to Yellowstone ecosystem, it was hunted to extinction in and around the park by Americans due to government predator control programs from the late 1800s until the mid to early 1900s. The last known wolf was killed in the park in 1926, and we'll see in this lecture this had a dramatic impact on the health of the park's ecosystem. Over the next 70 years, as elk populations exploded as a result of the lack of wolves, the predators, these elk began overgrazing many of the native plant species, such as the cottonwoods and aspens, and this led to a destruction of the land itself due to erosion from a lack of ground plants and from a lack of mature trees due to this overgrazing. The park killed elks on a regular basis to try and control their numbers, but in the 50s and 60s, local hunters actually began to complain to their state congressman because of this, because there were too few elk to hunt. So they stopped these killing programs. Elk populations rebounded, and again, it was a deadly cycle of destroying this ecosystem. The destruction of this landscape affected many other animals as well, and so it wasn't a good long-term solution to the health of Yellowstone's ecosystem. Because of the lack of this top predator in the park, again, the ecosystem itself began to deteriorate, and many of the species as well suffered as a result of the lack of wolves in the park. The reintroduction of the gray wolf to Yellowstone Park really began in the 1960s when our social and scientific understanding of these top predators and our understanding of natural ecosystems began to change. The wolf was actually one of the first animals that the United States listed as endangered after the passage of the Endangered Species Preservation Act of 1966, and then finally with the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Work actually began to bring the gray wolf back to the park and reintroduce this to that ecosystem. After more than 20 years, the first wolves were actually reintroduced to Yellowstone in 1995. There were 14 wolves that were reintroduced to the park. These wolves had actually been captured in Alberta, Canada, and were shipped to Yellowstone, where they were reintroduced to the ecosystem. Of course, we don't have enough time in class to study wolf biologies, wolf management, but to learn more about these issues, you can visit the two sites listed. One's the International Wolf Center, and the other one is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Today, there are approximately 10 wolf packs in Yellowstone National Park, totaling around 100 gray wolves in the park itself. These packs range in size from 3 wolves up to 20 wolves, and the video link that's shown here from PBS Nature is a documentary entitled In the Valley of Wolves, and it is an excellent documentary video that provides a very good glimpse of lives of these social animals in Yellowstone National Park.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years, that the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds and migratory birds started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. And the bears reinforced the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
Gray wolves themselves are actually very specialized organisms, and based on surveys by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, where they go out and estimate the number of kills by wolves in any one year, about 80% of all kills were elk, about 5% deer, and about 5% bison, and 5% coyotes. The remaining are a variety of other mammals. But the vast majority of these wolves are feeding on the elk population. So you have a very unique, very natural predator-prey interaction. The elk themselves, they're not preying indiscriminately on those elks. About 30% of these are calves, about 45% of them are females, and about 20% of the elk are male elk. It's very important as a population biologist to understand how species such as these gray wolves are reproducing, how diseases are acting on the packs, their hunting behavior, their territory use, inter and interpack relationships, and relationships with other predators. So wolf, bear, coyote hunting relationships, scavenging relationships. All of these things control the range, the dispersal, and the reproductive success of these organisms in Yellowstone National Park. As the success of the wolves are followed, then you can begin to understand how other species of plants and animals are affected by these types of interactions as well. Population densities can be very important for the success of a species. If there's too few individuals, there may not be enough for proper mating. If there's too many, you're going to have too much competition for resources for mates, and so that's going to cause problems as well. The distribution, spacing, and locations of individuals, whether they're plants or whether they're mammals, is going to be controlled by a variety of different factors in an ecosystem. You can have a clumped type of distribution, as you would see with these elk populations, And that's because it's a strategy to protect these elk from their predators such as the wolves. Humans also exhibit a clump type of distribution if you look at where you find the cities and towns all over the globe. The various wildfires that you find in Yellowstone National Park are a good example of random distribution. Yellowstone is home to over 60 different species of wildflowers that include phlox, yarrow, lupine, monkeyflower, iris, harebell, and a variety of other very colorful flowers. The winds themselves distribute these organisms all over the park, and so they have what we consider a random type of distribution. And finally, some organisms display a uniform distribution, as the case for the creosote bushes living in the desert biomes of the western United States. These organisms are evenly spaced out due to the availability of water in the desert, so that each plant competes with its neighbor for this abiotic limiting factor, and as a result, they have this rather uniform distribution in the landscape. Population biologists use a number of mathematical models to describe the growth of a population over time. The resources that are available to these organisms, the birth rate, the death rate, predator-prey relationships are all going to control the biotic potential or reproductive potential of a specific organism. Some organisms have very high biotic or reproductive potential, as is the example for these deer mice. Dandelions, spotted knapweed are also other examples that you'd find in Yellowstone that have high biotic potential. If you look at these organisms and their reproductive capabilities, if you assume that each mating pair produces 10 offspring, so that each adult is going to produce 5 offspring, you can then determine how many offspring you're going to have from any one breeding pair. So if you look at this graph here, number of population size here on the y-axis, breeding cycle on the x-axis. If we start off with 2 individuals here, then we go to 2 times 5 is 10 individuals, then 10 times 5 is 50 individuals, 50 times 5 is 250, 250 times 5 is 1250, 1250 times 5 is 6,250 individuals. So you can see over a very short breeding cycle, this population is going to grow exponentially. And these organisms, whether it's the deer mice or the knapweed or the dandelions, are going to display this exponential growth where their populations are really going to explode in a relatively short amount of time. Some things that may allow a population to have this exponential growth that we see here in this curve can be the removal of a top predator, as you would have in Yellowstone Park when you remove the wolves. But in this case, if you're looking at the spotted knotweed or the deer mice, all of these organisms have the capacity to grow in this exponential manner. However, this exponential growth does not last forever. Resources can become scarce, individuals starve or suffer from diseases. Aggression, competition is going to cause problems for these populations that limit their growth. And also, if you have predation or predators coming into this ecosystem, that's going to limit the growth of these organisms as well. As a result, your population is going to display this logistic growth, and that's if you have population size here on the y-axis over time. Here we have this exponential growth, but eventually it's going to level off and you're going to get this nice S-shaped curve where the organism is going to reach what is considered or called its carrying capacity. A number of factors are going to kick in and prevent this population of organisms from growing out of control. It can be disease, it can be predation, it can be competition, but you're going to get this S-shaped curve where the organism population is going to level off over time. As that population reaches the carrying capacity of that ecosystem, that population size is going to level out and it's going to be constant over a long period of time. A number of growth factors are going to control the carrying capacity of a particular organism. These are the resources that it needs to survive and reproduce, and this is really going to limit the size of that population in the ecosystem. A variety of different factors are going to affect population growth. Limiting factors, these are abiotic or biotic resources that an organism needs to survive and reproduce. They may be in short supply, and that scarcity is going to determine the carrying capacity of that ecosystem. Resistance factors, so you have competition, you have disease that's going to kill off a certain number of organisms, predation, all of these things are going to control the population size and growth. And so these two factors here, resistance and limiting factors, are referred to as density dependent. They depend on the density or number of organisms per unit area. There's other factors, though, that we refer to as density independent factors that are going to occur regardless of the population size. And these are generally natural disasters. So if we look at these density dependent factors, you have disease that may play an impact, predation that's going to control population, and competition for breeding and competition for nutrients, for resources. When you look at the density independent factors, you're talking about mainly natural disasters such as severe storms, avalanches, floods, and fires that you would have in a park such as Yellowstone. And so these things are going to occur no matter what the population density is of that ecosystem, and they're going to control the size of that population as well. Organisms can be grouped in their reproductive strategies or reproductive success. These organisms shown here, dandelions, deer mice, and spotted knapweed, are what are considered R-adapted species. The R stands for reproductive. So these are organisms that have high reproductive success, high rates of population increase. They are well adapted to exploit very unpredictable environments. These are considered niche generalists, meaning that they can live basically anywhere in the ecosystem because they're well adapted to change their habits to adapt to whatever place they're in. They reach sexual maturity very early. They have many small offspring, rapid growth, short lives, very little parental care, and again, they're adapted to living in unstable environments. Many of these are going to be prey species for other organisms in the ecosystem. And then the other types of organisms are the K-adapted species, K for carrying capacity, and these would be the elk, the spruce trees, and the grizzly bears that you would find in Yellowstone National Park. They have low reproductive rates. They have evolved to live in very stable environmental conditions, and they decrease or increase very slowly in size as resource availability changes. So these are largely the predators. These are called niche specialists, so they are adapted and have evolved to live in a particular area in the ecosystem. And if that area becomes disturbed or destroyed, it's really going to impact the population. They have longer lives. They are late to mature sexually. They have very few offspring, and they do spend a great deal of time with those offspring raising them. They're adapted to very stable environments, and so they cannot adapt their lifestyles to change if you have encroachment of humans or you have other disasters that are going to impact or destroy their ecosystem. One of the big organisms living in the park is the bison. In the early 1800s, the United States had an estimated 30 million bison roaming the West. Today we have less than 500,000. Most of these actually are not pure bison, but they've been crossbred with other cattle for beef, for meat, and it's estimated that only about 20,000 free-ranging bison still live today. These are the bison in Yellowstone Park. This is near the Teton Mountains. And the link here from PBS Independent Lens actually shows a very good story about the reintroduction of the bisons to the Montana area where the Sioux tribes live in the Fort Peck Indian Reservation. And so this is a very nice video that shows how humans interact with these organisms and how we're trying to reintroduce them into their native environments after we have basically decimated them through uncontrolled hunting practices of the 1800s. The grizzly bears are another prominent K-adapted species of the park. They are often out in the summer times feeding with their young, so they're very fun to see. The video here actually shows about the progression of the grizzly bear in the United States. The grizzly bears were not treated very well in the U.S. even as early as the 1970s. In fact, we fed them at Yellowstone out of the dumps. People would feed them from their cars, and this was a very unnatural environment for the grizzly bears to live in. The Yellowstone Grizzly Bear Restoration Project really brought them back into their natural habitat, and you really have these grizzly bears living as they would maybe 500, 1,000 years ago. And so if you see them in the park today, you're going to observe them living in more or less a natural ecosystem.
We're patient people. We believe that the Creator lays life out for us.
I gotta be like them buffalo and face that storm.
When we took the buffalo away from the Indian people, we took part of the soul of the Indian people.
Chie nupa. Wana he depends luha he. Ladies and gentlemen, if you'd come on in, grab a seat, we'll get started here in just a little bit. It's a very historical day. And of course to us Dakota, Nakona, Lakota people that live here on the Fort Peck Reservation, we can definitely prosper from this and we'll continue to live as Dakota people. So just kind of hang in there for a bit. We'll get situated and we'll rock and roll. And Richard, if you could take pictures just on this side. Right, yeah, this is my good side over here. At this time, we're going to go back to the Tatanka Oyate singers. That's what we look to ourselves as in Northern Plains Indians. We call ourselves the Buffalo people.
Our people have called ourselves buffalo chasers for forever. The buffalo signifies prosperity. It's a symbol that means to us that life is going to be good. Our kids are not going to go hungry. For us, buffalo are a very important symbol for who we are as people.
Our ancestors, that was our mainstay. You know, they provided everything that we needed. They needed to survive.
If you've ever read the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851, we signed that treaty, and one of the stipulations was that we would be able to hunt as long as the buffalo roam. But one thing the federal government didn't tell us is at that time when we signed that treaty, they were taking the buffalo away from us by annihilating them as fast as they could.
Historically, there were probably 20 to 30 million bison roaming across North America. And in the 1800s, there was a great slaughter of almost all of them.
After they put us on reservations and we lost the use of our buffalo and they started giving us beef, you know, that was probably one of our downfalls as far as our health was concerned.
The way we live now on this reservation, the way the Indian people are, the government has succeeded in what they wanted to do. They civilized us.
The Yellowstone herd is about 3,500 or so wild bison. They're the only bison that have been continuously wild, by far the most genetically pure bison remaining on Earth. Today, most of the bison that you see on the landscape are in captive herds on ranches and have cattle genes mixed in. They've also been semi-domesticated. The Yellowstone bison are the only ones that have been wild and no cattle genes introgression has occurred. That makes them really unique for bison conservation. Yellowstone is very hostile terrain really for bison. It's cold and there's deep snow a long period of the year. During that time, the bison of Yellowstone tried to roam down into lower elevations for grass. When they do, they leave the park, and this has caused conflict over the years. In the past, they've all been hazed, rounded up, captured, even shipped to slaughter because of a fear of disease that the bison could pass to cattle. Although it's never happened, it is theoretically possible. Part of an experiment that started a few years ago was to take some of the bison that were coming out of Yellowstone and instead of slaughter them, put them in a quarantine facility to see if over a few years they could remove this disease, brucellosis, from these bison. The bison were put into a quarantine facility, so from the relative freedom of Yellowstone National Park, now they, for several years, have been in a very small, enclosed, fenced area. Some of them were even born in captivity.
It was a pilot study to see if we could take bison from an infected herd, the Yellowstone herd, put them through a quarantine process and have brucellosis-free bison at the end.
What do you think, girls?
We wanted to be able to take some animals from Yellowstone and be able to move them into other parts of the country and preserve the genetics in other populations. We've put in a lot of effort and time and money from all the agencies to get to this point, and we feel that it worked, and so we would hope that they would continue doing it and be valuable to wherever they go.
The hope is to restore additional herds from Yellowstone bison to other places in the Great Plains, the historic heart of the range of the American bison. The Fort Peck tribes have been the first to step forward to take on this opportunity.
We first brought our interest in 2007 when an interagency buffalo management plan proposed to anybody that was interested in acquiring these buffalo, as soon as they passed the quarantine facilities, would be eligible to take them in, and that's what we would like to acquire for our cultural herd. The two range units that the tribes are looking at putting the cultural herd from the Yellowstone bison is range unit 62 and 63. We applied for it in 2007. Tribal Executive Board gave us 4,800 acres. Then we run into probably about 4 years more of hurdles through the legislature process where various other groups were opposed to our plans.
There are those people that tell us that it's impossible to maintain these herds of buffalo, that these bison will compete for grass with the rightful owners of the grass, cattle.
The tribe is exercising their sovereign right to make a determination on how do they want our economy to go. Cattle raising and farming and ranching are important, but we have to learn how to coexist with native buffalo. The wild animals have the same right to live here as domestic animals.
been a long battle since the last 5 years fighting for them. And now it's 2012, and it might actually become a reality. After 7 years of working on it, I'm glad it's finally coming to where the buffalo actually get to be on the plains and know that they're home again. They're a plains animal, but for the last 150 years, they've been pushed into the mountains, and now we're giving them a chance to come back. This here is basically the new holding facilities that will house the bison in. They'll approximately be in here about 9 weeks to while we get this fence all finished up for them.
So this makes it over 7,000 acres.
It's 6,900 acres will make it.
Okay. This is all possible because of Robbie Magnan, the director of Fort Peck Fish and Game. He had the vision to prepare a place for the Yellowstone bison before he had any idea whether the state would approve the move. It's all because he's moved forward ahead of the curve and just prepared a spot. It would not have happened without Robbie.
So you'll put it back into prairie?
Yep.
And then take the fences down in the middle there? And
Right.
Great.
And it'll just become a pasture.
Okay, are we set to try to run buffalo in?
What?
Are we set to run buffalo in?
Yeah.
Okay.
We've had these bison here for about 3.5 years, and today is a good day because these guys finally get to go and be free. So we're really looking forward to that. All we got to do is get them loaded and get them out of here.
Well, today is a very exciting day. It's been a day that many people have been waiting for a long time. 65 genetically pure Yellowstone bison are being transported from a quarantine facility on the edge of Yellowstone National Park to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, and they will be restored as the Fort Peck's tribal cultural bison herd.
Today is a very special day for us. It's like the coming home of our prosperity.
We're down here at Corwin Springs picking up Yellowstone bison. It's been in the quarantine for the last few years. I worked around cattle all my life, and similar concept, but it's a whole different deal.
These are the first bison to leave Yellowstone region alive in decades.
Hopefully they don't get too bad. Hopefully the roads get better as we go.
That is a long ride for a buffalo, for any wildlife.
We have an opportunity, an historic opportunity, to repopulate the entire western United States in every place that people desire to have this majestic animal back. This will be the place that will be the supply of those bison. And they're back to be that symbol of pride, not only for the Indian people, but this entire country. They're here to stay. Zone 3.
Wow, you see, he's hanging around Indians so much, you know how you could tell? And another thing, I knew what he was talking about, but didn't even hear him. He said, and they were running.
Imagine a creature returning from the brink.
You guys gotta get back. Go!
To a different world.
The only thing that was separated us was this screen.
But can they survive on a modern frontier? Next time on Nature.
So different species are going to display different population dynamics in the Yellowstone ecosystem. A grizzly bear, a K-adapted species, is going to display slow increases and decreases in responses to changes in the environment. An R-selected species, such as this mouse here, is going to be able to reproduce very quickly. They're going to have high biotic success. You're going to have high peaks that may overshoot the carrying capacity, followed by these crashes where the populations are going to be decimated and they go well below the carrying capacity. And that's what's shown here. If you have this exponential growth, it's going to overshoot the carrying capacity here. It's going to overshoot. You're going to have this crash. It's going to overshoot again, crash, and eventually it should level off to the carrying capacity. You can also observe predator-prey cycles. This is a good example from Isle Royale, Michigan, where you're looking at the wolves and moose populations. So you have predator and prey here. The moose populations are shown in blue, and the wolf populations over time are shown in orange. The dates go from 1955 till about present day. And you can see that as you have an increase in the moose population, you have an increase of the wolf population followed slowly behind. Then as they prey on these moose, the population is going to decrease. The wolf population is going to decrease, and so you have these predator-prey cycles. The other thing that we can see here is this is a parvo epidemic that killed off a lot of the wolves in this area. In fact, it killed off about 80% of the wolves. As the wood populations decreased, again, the moose populations are going to explode. Eventually, the wolves are going to be able to feed again on those moose. Those populations are going to increase, and here we have another crash due to a harsh winter. So you're going to see these populations in any type of natural ecosystem when you look at predator-prey relationships. When you look at Yellowstone National Park, these different populations of elk and these populations of wolves and the population of aspen trees that are shown here, these populations interact with one another. We don't often see how a wolf's going to interact with a tree population, but in fact they did, and that's what was shown in the 1960s and 70s in the park. When you had the aspen trees in the park, you can see that they were fed on by the elk in the wintertime. So the snow would have covered the grass here. The elk were not able to reach the snow, so they fed on the different tree saplings in and around the park. As a result, they girdle these trees, essentially killing off these trees, and so you're killing off these organisms or these trees in the park. That's because you have high populations of elk, because there are no wolves there to keep those population numbers down. So as a result, when you don't have wolves in the ecosystem of Yellowstone, the trees are going to have problems, the songbirds are going to experience problems, the elks are going to be able to flourish, but other organisms such as these beavers are not going to be able to flourish. And that's what was observed in the park when the wolves were eradicated from the park in the late 1800s, early 1900s. When the wolves were not in the park, the beavers began to thrive and build dams, creating ponds and lakes. The elks themselves were able to feed in the willow thickets. As a result, they overgrazed these areas, and over time, you didn't have these aspens here, you didn't have these willow trees here, and so there were no trees for the beavers, so the beavers would leave as well. If there's no trees, the songbirds, again, aren't going to have a place where they can reproduce. So without having the wolf in this ecosystem, you're really having all these different organisms being negatively impacted from losing this top-down predator. When the wolves were reintroduced into the park, they began to feed on the high populations of elk. As a result, the trees are going to be able to grow in the park. That's going to bring back the beavers. That's going to bring back the birds, because now they have places that they can reproduce, places that they can have their food, raise their offspring. And so having the wolves back into the park has impacted all these other organisms in a very positive way. So you can really see in these ecosystems, where you remove a particular population of species, that's going to have dramatic impacts on all the other organisms living in the ecosystem as well. And so you can apply everything that you've learned here to different ecosystems as well, whether you're talking about freshwater or marine ecosystems, whether you're talking about temperate or tropical rainforest ecosystems. All of these systems are going to behave more or less the same when you're talking about the populations of the different species living in there. These are a few other examples that you can apply what you've learned here to a number of different ecosystems all around the world.